My wall. Okie dokie. I'm gonna go ahead and get started. Today, we're gonna talk more about the organizational part of organizational psych. Oh, okay. I also wanted to let everybody know I caught up with posting the videos. So they are all up on YouTube and you can access them through the link on Blackboard, or you should be able to just search my name and there's a whole playlist. I have 100 subscribers now, y'all. I'm an influencer or something. Not really. I'm like, why are people subscribing to me? Okay, go ahead. Alrighty, so we talked about industrial psych. Now we're going to talk about the organizational psych side. Occasionally you will see these split into different programs. More often you'll see these split into different courses. But the vast majority of the time, if you're looking at like a graduate program, it's going to be in industrial organizational psych. So sort of combining these two things. So organizational psychology has an emphasis on research and practice involving human relations. And we're going to go into each of these topics in organizational psychology in a lot more detail. So things like, how do you approach management? What is people's job satisfaction and how can we make that better? How committed are employees and how can we make that better? The meaning of work to people. Is it just a job and you're just punching in, punching out, or does it actually have more meaning? And we'll talk about leadership styles as well, and which of those is more effective. And if you don't get this list down, don't worry. Each of them is going to have their own slide. And for whatever reason, our captions went away. Hang on. Oh, because I was signed out randomly for no good reason. Hang on just a sec, y'all. Gotta love technology. Oh, cool. Now I get to find my slide again. Hey, at least I found my slide pretty easily. Okay. There we go. Okay, so different management approaches. So what they did initially was not to try to go in and like impose a management style. They just sort of studied and said, how are people managing? And are there different styles? And are there ones that are more effective, or maybe ones that are more effective in particular types of companies? And so there's this style they call the Japanese management style. And this comes from the automotive industry. So W. Edwards Deming, D-E-M-I-N-G, in the 1940s, started to really focus on quality of the product you're producing. The Japanese learned about this philosophy, and they picked up on it, and it really came into play. So if you've ever thought about or know someone who's driven a Japanese designed car, they tend to hold their value for longer. And that's because of this philosophy, this management philosophy, where they really emphasize quality over just kind of getting it done. Even though it was an American who came up with this, the Americans, even within the auto industry, didn't pick up on this and use it until the 1980s. So 40 years later, when Japanese car companies became dominant. So up until then, people in America in particular were buying American cars. And then in the 80s, Japanese companies became much more popular. And Americans were sort of like, how do we compete? And they started to pick up this philosophy. This philosophy really helped the Japanese after World War II. So if you think about it historically, right, we were fighting against the Japanese. It was the Japanese who bombed Pearl Harbor, right? And a lot of Japan was sort of decimated population-wise, reputation-wise, following World War II, and this helped quite a bit. Another part of the Japanese management style is that the industry must embrace innovation and be prepared for the future. So you can't just keep doing what you've always done and think, yeah, this will be fine, right? You've got to be thinking about what's going to be next and be willing to innovate. Theory X managers are managers who motivate by exerting control and threatening punishment. You can imagine, this is not very popular among employees, right? Under Theory X management style, work is innately unpleasant, and people have a strong desire to avoid it. The idea behind Theory X is like the way to be successful is to keep your employees in line. Again, for the vast majority of people, this won't even actually be that motivating, as you can imagine. People will just kind of go to work, check in, check out, right? Do what they have to do, but not really be motivated to go over and above. So that's Theory X. Theory Y has managers who motivate by allowing workers to participate, particularly in problem solving. So an issue comes up with the company or an issue comes up with a design. They don't just say, fix it this way. They get workers involved in the process. Engaging in effortful behavior is natural for human beings. Even at play, people work hard. If you've ever seen people playing like recreationally, something like softball or kickball, right? People get really into it. I remember at one point when I first got here, so this was like 13 years ago now, there were student versus faculty wiffle ball games. And we had our art historian faculty member had never really played baseball, but she played tennis. So she would just take the bat and hit it out there. So like she wanted to win and she was going to make it work. People also tend to seek out responsibility in a Theory Y setup, and like you can reward them by promoting them, giving them additional responsibility. And then there's strengths-based management. And this is maximizing an employee's existing strengths. And within this context, strengths-based management, they say that's much easier than trying to like build them from the ground up to do something they might not naturally be inclined to do. In this case, they're defining strength as a consistent ability to attain near perfect performance on a particular task. And the argument here is that each person has unique talents, and you want to discover them and put them to use. And that's key to the company's success, but it's also key to the workers having a sense of fulfillment, therefore wanting to stay at the job. Something a lot of people don't know is that when you have to replace an employee, it often is really expensive. You've got to devote time to hiring, right? Oftentimes you have to pay the new employee more than you were paying the last employee. I know, for example, within academia, and that's because of how we do our interviews. We like fly people out, we give them meals, we put them up at a hotel, but it costs 1.5 times as much as the person who left salary just to hire a new person. That's really expensive, right? So the idea behind strengths-based management is like, let's keep who we have and keep them happy. And so this is a chart kind of breaking down what are the similarities, what are the differences. I mentioned Deming for the Japanese style. The manager's mission here is to focus on the future. They're seeking innovation, they're seeking high quality. They also want to forge strong relationships with people in every part of the organization. Doesn't matter if you're a worker on the assembly line or a vice president. They want those strong relationships. Now, the manager's problem-solving strategy here is taking risks, thinking about the future, trying new things, not being set in old ways. And the manager's focus when things are going well is to keep looking at the future, looking for potential innovation, but also thinking about risks and risk management. As you can see, McGregor came up with both Theory X and Theory Y. And in Theory X, the manager's mission is to control the employees, enforce the rules, make sure everyone is working hard, keep the ship afloat. And in Theory Y, you're challenging the employees with responsibility, letting them apply their talents, insights, and abilities. In Theory X, the manager's problem-solving strategy is to punish the employees who failed. Whereas in Theory Y, it's looking for input from the employees, harnessing their wisdom and insight, and not just thinking you as a manager have all the answers. So when things are going well in Theory X, you might reward the employees who succeed, but you don't rock the boat. You don't try to innovate. When things are going well for Theory Y managers, you're going to talk to your employees about their insights into why they're successful and like what should be our next steps. In strengths-based, which comes from Clifton, the manager's mission is to identify those employee strengths and match employees with jobs that will maximize these. Their problem-solving strategy is to re-examine the fit between employee strengths and assigned tasks. And then the manager's focus when things are going well is to continue to build on those employee strengths. So as you can see, these all have the potential to be positive, probably with the exception of Theory X, right? Theory X, you're probably not going to enjoy working in that environment as an employee. Although unfortunately, a lot of places do operate under this. And one thing I should say too is that like, there are going to be places that have a mix of these styles, right? There won't necessarily be everyone is like pure Theory X, pure Theory Y, things along those lines. All right, so job satisfaction. One of the things that organizational psychologists do is try to like think about job satisfaction, how to increase it within a given company. So one of the things we do is measure work attitude. So we can give employees rating scales, and industrial organizational psychologists work really hard to create good, reliable scales in these areas, just like personality theorists do when they're trying to measure personality traits. You also have them really focusing in on the factors that seem to be important to job satisfaction. So things like fairness of compensation, right? If you're doing a high-risk job, you should be getting hazard pay, right? If you are the top earner in the company, you should be getting raises and bonuses, right? Also looking at personality characteristics of individuals. I think I may have mentioned this when we talked about personality, but a lot of companies are starting to look at like the big 5 personality traits. When they're hiring, when they're matching people to jobs, things along those lines. You also want to think about cultural influences. So what cultural influences are influencing how you created the company and are running the company, but then also what cultural influences are happening for individuals within your company that might be at odds with things. We know that studying and improving job satisfaction is really important for a number of reasons. A, just in theory, right, you should want your employees to be happy, right? Not always the case, of course. Unfortunately, there are people in managerial positions who just don't care about things like that. But it also pays off for the company. When people are satisfied with their jobs, there's lower absenteeism and turnover. So you're not having to scramble to cover somebody's responsibilities when they don't show up. And again, as we just talked about, when there's turnover, when you have to hire more people, that costs you money. You also have to train the new people, and that costs you money. We also see that people who are satisfied with their jobs have better organizational citizenship. So what that means is they are the folks who are much more likely to step up, to say, oh, if someone needs to get that done, I'll do it, no problem. Or to say, hey, what if we, went above and beyond and did this thing? I can do that. And also just performance by whatever metric you're measuring, right? Whether that's sales, whether that is getting things done. People who have higher job satisfaction have better job performance. And again, like none of this seems that world breaking, right? Like, of course they do. But sadly, there are folks who don't think about these things, don't care about these things, and just like see their employees as like cogs in the machine. And unfortunately, their companies suffer as well as their employees as a result. Employee commitment is related to that idea of organizational citizenship. So it's in the organization's interest to keep a person around. They've often liked the people they hired, that hired them for a reason, right? They were a good fit for the job. And they've spent time and money to train them, right? To bring them in. And then one of the things I don't have in my notes, but that we should think about is that in some fields, you don't want that person going to the competitor, right? And making your competitor stronger. If we're thinking about like tech fields, right? People always competing to have the next most exciting smartphone. If you've got a really innovative engineer and you're not treating them well, and they go, let's say you're Apple and they go work for Samsung, and all of a sudden the Samsung phone looks better, right? That can be at your real disadvantage. So affective commitment is your emotional attachment to the organization. So some people will feel really happy about an organization. Some people will get like really emotionally attached, right? Like, I think about where I went to undergrad, Kenyon College. We had, so like at big events here, we'll sing our alma mater song. It's a little like on the Taylor by the Bay song. at Kenyon, there were 4 distinct songs, and every year, the first years sang them, like, as like a welcome to the college, and then the seniors sang them the day before they graduated. And then when you go back for alumni weekend, you also sing them. And like, when I was back for alumni weekend singing one of the Kenyon songs, I like started crying, right? And like, obviously that's not necessarily a corporation, but it's like, I feel that emotional attachment to this place. It makes me happy. Continuance commitment is the perception of the economic and social costs of leaving the organization. So like, if I leave this organization, I may not be able to get a good job, I'll lose all my friends. Versus, you know, if you don't have good continuance commitment, that person might be like, if I go to the company across town, I can make double the salary. Why would I not do that? Right? So you got to treat your employees well and make sure you're competitive. And the normative commitment is a sense of obligation to the organization. So the idea of like, this is the place that pays me, therefore I got to put in my best work. Ideally, obviously, you would want people who have all of these, and those are the employees who are going to stay, right? But again, if you're not treating your employees well, this won't necessarily happen. And there are some types of companies where they expect a lot of turnover, right? So I think someplace like a retail store or a fast food restaurant kind of knows that people will be doing that as like their first job and like might only be able to do it for a couple years and then go on, right? But like Fortune 500 companies, universities, right? They want to try to keep people and build up that institutional memory. Another thing we look at, or organizational psychologists look at, is the idea of the meaning of work. So how you think about and see and conceptualize your job can have an impact on performance, but also on your life in general, right? So there's a lot of talk about work-life balance, right? And burnout and things like that. And so we know like the pattern and the expectations of jobs can really influence your life outside of work as well. So organizational psychologists talk about jobs, careers, and callings. So a job is something you have no training or maybe very little training. You have no personal control. Maybe little to no freedom other than to leave it and go to another place. If you're thinking about your job as a career, that's thinking about it as work as an opportunity for advancement. So you're thinking, this will get me a promotion, I can work my way up the corporate ladder. Or sometimes you're thinking, I work this job for a while and then I can get a job at the better company because I'll have experience. A calling is when your work has value beyond economics. It's not just a paycheck. So for me, teaching is my calling. I was very fortunate to have a 6-month maternity leave because our provost at the time loved babies. And so he was like, yeah, sure, take that much time off. And I enjoyed it. And it was really valuable time bonding with my daughter, caring for her before she entered daycare. But by the end of it, I was ready to come back. And I realized I genuinely missed teaching because I genuinely enjoy sharing knowledge with all y'all. And that made me realize that like the teaching part of being a professor is my calling. Like the other stuff I'll do because I have to, right? But like I genuinely enjoy being in the classroom, interacting with y'all. And so that's my calling. Now, how does that relate to employees' psychological well-being? Well, we know that there are higher levels of job satisfaction and life satisfaction when people see their occupation as a calling. And that's linked to overall psychological well-being. Sorry, just checking to make sure nothing's on fire. Nope, just turning off my vibration. So happiness, mental health, right? Things along those lines, being able to function at your optimal level. All those things are linked to psychological well-being. And you're much more likely to have that if you see your job as a calling. Job crafting are the physical and cognitive changes that people make within existing task constraints. So this is when people make their work their own. And so maybe you have a job you don't particularly like, but you're able to focus on one aspect of it, or come up with tasks that are really important to you and give you a sense of fulfillment. So maybe you're working for a Fortune 500 company and just sort of like drudgery, sitting at a desk day in, day out. And then a project comes along and you're like, this really has meaning to me. I think I can imbue my individuality. I have some really good ideas for this, and your boss lets you work on it. And you figure out this is the way I can be happy at my job. And job crafting often benefits the company as well, because now folks are being innovative, contributing more, and just happier and being more productive. Now, how about leadership styles? We see two main leadership styles, and as you can imagine, they are going to influence folks and influence a work environment in very important ways. So transactional leadership is basically a theory X manager. So they're going to emphasize the exchange relationship between workers and leader. You need to do things for me. Transactional leadership believes people are motivated by rewards and punishments. An advantage here is they're going to provide clarity and structure to employees. Transformational leadership, on the other hand, is going to emphasize change and have an actual vision for the organization. It's not going to be, we're just going to check boxes every day, right? It's here are our goals, here are our values, here's what we want to be doing as a corporation. There are 4 key elements here. The first is to provide idealized influence, and I'm going to type these in here, just because I feel like it'd be helpful to have them in here. So providing idealized influence, thinking about things from a values-driven perspective, giving people a reason why you're doing things the way you are. And part of that goes into inspiring others to achieve, right? If there is a reason you're excited about what the company is doing, that's going to motivate other people. You also want to intellectually stimulate your employees. You don't want to hire a bunch of people with master's degrees and have them just sit around and push buttons all day, right? You want to come up with problem solving. Another big one, and again, this one feels like it should be obvious, but showing concern for employees and their well-being. So showing concern for employee well-being. Right, recognizing your employees are people, recognizing there are times they can't work optimally, and instead of yelling at them, be like, what's going on? How can I support you? So the 4 key elements of transformational leadership: promote employees' organizational identity, that sort of affective commitment to the corporation or organization, right? This could be a nonprofit, this could be a school, right? And it redefines organizational culture. If you have a transformational leader, the culture is going to be very different. People aren't going to be just doing their work because they're afraid they'll get punished if they don't get it done. They're doing their work because they understand why they're doing their work and what the end goals are, and we're all working towards this together. Now, what about organizational culture? These are the shared beliefs, norms, and customs. And all of these things are going to influence everyday behavior of employees. To have a positive organizational culture, you want to incorporate a lot of different things. One is being positive reinforcement, rewarding people for good work. Unfortunately, in a lot of organizations, the reward for good work is more work. Like, oh, you got that done already? Cool. Joe Bob's not doing his job. Why don't you pick up the slack for him? And that doesn't mean you're getting any additional compensation, right? It just means your reward for work is more work. That's not very reinforcing to folks. This comes from learning theory, the idea that people are more likely to keep doing good work if they're rewarded for it. So the idea again would be something like a bonus, a raise, a promotion, right, for the folks who are your best workers. Unfortunately, this doesn't happen in a lot of places. Nepotism is still alive and well. If you're not familiar with what that is, it is, hiring and promoting family members or people who are your buddies, right, over your most hardworking employees. And then compassion is another important piece of this. So empathizing, there we go, with the suffering of another and doing something to try to alleviate that suffering. So empathizing with the suffering of, in this case, your employees, and doing something to alleviate that suffering. So this is doing nice things for employees. And a lot of people, unfortunately, again, in this day and age, get this wrong. And they're like, you're doing a good job, pizza party. Or we're going to do a happy hour, but it's after work and you have to come, right? Instead of doing things people actually need. So for example, when we talked about the Container Store on Monday, they have kid-friendly hours from 9 to 2 so that the parents can both drop off and pick up their own kids. They don't have to hire childcare for before or after school. A lot of companies are now offering like flex time. So for example, at the shipyard in Portsmouth, my husband is able to work from like 6:30 to 2:30 so that I can get our kiddo to school in the morning, and then I come in and teach, and he can go pick her up. And then again, we don't have to worry about childcare. Each of us sort of takes one end of that. And there are even shipyard employees who were like, both of them work at the shipyard, and one will take that 6 o'clock shift and maybe another will take like an 8 o'clock shift, right? And they share the load. And it's compassion is employers recognizing the things that will actually help their employees, again, rather than just throwing something trivial at them. Like, I don't know, people may have seen the posts about like Nurse Appreciation Week, and they'll give people like a mint. And you're like, good job, here's a mint, right? And it's like, okay, maybe something a little more helpful, right? Would be there. Virtuousness is another part of positive organizational culture. And this is moral goodness. This is doing the right thing. So I don't know how much they use it anymore, but one of Google's like internal mottos used to be, don't be evil. Right? Like, we have the potential to have a lot of power. Let's not use it for nefarious purposes. So you want to be doing the right thing, having moral goodness. Studies show that virtuousness can buffer against negative effects of other things at work, even downsizing, which is dramatically cutting the workforce. So like, if you can explain there's a moral reason why we're doing this, right? People are going to be more okay with like losing their jobs, which sounds really weird, but it's true. And again, if you can explain to people like there are morally good reasons why we're doing something, right? they're much more likely to be on board with doing it. We know, however, that not every workplace has a positive organizational culture. And so one of the things that organizational psychologists will study is toxic workplaces. What are the factors that go into people just feeling like they don't want to be at work, work is problematic. And these include workplace incivility. So that is people being very impolite to each other, cold to each other, or sometimes even like genuinely hostile towards each other, right? I have a colleague who told the story about not here, but his previous institution. There was a faculty meeting and it literally ended in a fist fight. And it just like boggles my mind. Like, how can you get that worked up about something in a faculty meeting that you want to fight somebody, right? Here we're just like, whatever, right? But, you know, obviously that's a big piece of a toxic work environment. Workplace aggression and violence goes into what I just did. But we can see things like verbal abuse, bullying of employees, right? People just keeping their head down. And unfortunately, as we've seen in cases all over the country and very close to home here, sometimes this can escalate to homicide, right? So if we think about the Virginia Beach Municipal Building shooting, right? That was a disgruntled former employee who came in and killed a whole bunch of city employees. And there are other cases where that has happened. And the bad thing about that, one of the really interesting things I learned when I did the FBI training on mass shooter events is most of the time, the vast majority of the time, the people who are going to perpetuate a mass shooting are the people who have access already, right? So like, hopefully we never have to deal with this here. But if there was a mass shooter at Wesleyan, it would be someone who could flash their ID at the gate, right? And that's what happened with this guy, is like, he still had access to the building through his card, right? Like they hadn't revoked it. I'm trying to like scare you guys, sorry. This is not supposed to be like Halloween, woo, right? But just sort of like knowledge of knowing that toxic workplaces can, in very extreme circumstances, get people killed, right? And then sexual harassment is what we're going to start talking about on this next slide here. And so sexual harassment is really interesting. It's something that wasn't really articulated in very clear ways until the 90s, but it always existed. So sexual harassment occurs when employees are subjected to unwelcome behavior that has some sort of sexual element to it. This says like sexually oriented. That feels weird in terms of a definition, but it's, you know, there's something sexual about it. There are two main types of sexual harassment. One is quid pro quo, and I think this is the one people tend to think of when they think of workplace harassment. This is the idea that you have to do something sexual in order to get a job, keep your job, get a promotion, things like this, right? And there have unfortunately been circumstances where that was the case. I'll only give you that promotion if you sleep with me, or like the Harvey Weinstein case in Hollywood, but he would only like give women roles if they slept with him. And so there are women who are very talented actresses who just like didn't get work for a while because they said no. So that's quid pro quo, but there's also what's called hostile environment. And behavior that creates a hostile environment leads to workplaces with unwanted sexual behavior, typically discussion or material. So once I had like our former HR director come in and talk about cases, not here, but like throughout Virginia. And like one was, there was a garage where all the men purposely put up like naked calendars to make the female employees uncomfortable. Or this could be where people are always telling sexually oriented jokes, right? And it makes people uncomfortable. Or they are, again, they're not making employment contingent on it, but they're always making jokes or sly remarks about people. Now, in terms of prevalence, sexual harassment is unfortunately fairly widespread. Approximately 42% of female workers have reported it. And why I emphasize reported it is we know that a lot of people who are sexually harassed don't report it. And this is for a host of reasons. Maybe the person sexually harassing you is the person you would have reported to, right? Maybe you're afraid of losing your job if you report it. Or maybe you tried to report it and the person you initially went to gaslit you, right? Or said, you need to shut up about this. I was unfortunately sexually harassed at one experience in the past. I went by a supervisor, went to a female supervisor to report it. Didn't think in my mind she's friends with him. And she told me, you're overreacting. He didn't do that. And when I started crying in her office because of this, she told me, you're just tired and stressed out, and that's why you're crying. Now, I learned afterwards, I was pretty young at this time, but I learned afterwards that that's illegal. She legally wasn't allowed to not escalate my case to the next level. But I didn't know that because I was young, right? I needed this job. And so there's a lot of reasons why people don't report or like try to report and it doesn't go anywhere. Consequences of sexual harassment for the person being harassed include anger, reduced self-esteem, and some clear psychological factors: depression, anxiety. If the sexual harassment has a physical component to it, we could be talking about post-traumatic stress disorder. We also see lowered productivity and, maybe not surprisingly, decreased commitment to the employer. You're not going to feel very loyal to an employer who allows this to go on. So how do we stop sexual harassment? Well, we want to, and organizations should, promote norms that are intolerant of sexual harassment. Whereas if we see it, we immediately say, like, that's not cool. Why are you doing that? Right? And I think we're starting to see that a little bit more. Again, definitely not widespread, but I'm seeing more circumstances where that happens, where someone else steps in. Workers should be educated about recognizing sexual harassment. And in fact, a lot of companies include this in training annually. Sometimes these trainings are good, sometimes they are not helpful, right? They improved ours here, and ours is linked to Title IX, which is what governs it for students, sexual harassment for students, because essentially during the Obama administration, and then Biden has reinforced it. The idea is if you're being sexually harassed or sexually assaulted, regardless of your gender, right, you are not having an equal educational experience. So we are not going to tolerate that within educational settings. And so as a result, every employee of Wesleyan does an annual training on Title IX. And it used to just be like a quiz in Blackboard, and it was really bad because the answers were really obvious. And now there's like an actual like video module that explains things well. It's shocking, right? Like, good training, what? And so we need to do this well. Organizations should also have clear policies that expressly forbid harassment and grievance procedures to handle those allegations of harassment. We do have that for students. It's a little more murky for employees here, but I think they're working to improve it. They just sent Dr. Slivka, who's the head of our Gender, Women, and Sexuality Studies program, to a training in Philly for like a week about this. So they are working on making sure we have clear policies related to this as well. So one of the things that we do as IO psychologists, I say we as if I'm an IO psychologist, I'm not an IO psychologist, but one of the things that IO psychologists do is try to focus on health and wellness at work. We know that people have a lot of stress on the job. And we know that stress is related to a whole host of not only mental, but physical health issues, right? So we know that stress is related to cardiovascular disease. It exacerbates things like diabetes or other autoimmune disorders. Obviously, it's going to be related to mental health issues like depression, anxiety. So if we can work on making people's jobs less stressful, we can do that. Now, one of the things I'm going to say here is that a lot of corporations are now at least paying lip service to this idea. That being said, the way they're doing this, in my opinion, as a psychologist, as someone trained in clinical psychology, so I know it actually helps people. A lot of times this is very like performative and lip service. So like, for example, people are often stressed on the job because, as I mentioned, you're given work beyond your own work when you're good at doing work, right? And they don't have enough time and they don't have enough resources to get done what they need to get done. And instead of like trying to better divvy up work or hiring more people when people are overworked, employers will be like, you are required to come to this mandatory meeting on wellness over lunch and there's no food. Or like, you have to do this yoga session. Nothing worse than like forcing someone to do yoga. Not gonna work, right? So that is a big piece of this as well. So employers who truly want to help job stress should actually think about, how do I alleviate day-to-day stress for folks? Another thing that comes into play is role conflict. So when you're trying to meet the demands of more than one important life role. So being a worker and a parent, and maybe you're also caring for your aging parents, right? And you're a volunteer in your community, and you still want to be a good spouse to your partner, right? All that can really build up and create tension. And again, that's why places that are able to alleviate some of those demands and have things like flex hours or on-site daycare can make a huge difference for employees. Burnout is something that has almost become like a trendy word, but it's a really important factor to understand. And this is emotional exhaustion and lack of motivation. So people who experience burnout can get confusion, worry, resentment towards their jobs. They can have physical symptoms of all the things we just talked about. Plus they'll get like chronic headaches. They'll get like gastrointestinal issues, problems with their sleep. You'll see behavioral issues like absenteeism. Some people will start using substances to try to cope, drugs, alcohol. And then you'll also see emotional things like being really cynical, being irritable, being anxious. None of those, as you can imagine, contribute to a healthy, supportive workplace. And it results typically from chronic work stress, and usually for a job that has way too high of demands. So how do you measure job or manage job stress? One is leisure, like making sure you carve out time to do things you genuinely enjoy. We just know from the clinical psych literature that engaging in activities you enjoy not only like helps your heart, helps your mood, but like actually prevents things like depression. Making sure you take your vacations, take your paid time off. There are a lot of employees, particularly in America, my understanding, like in Europe and other places, this is not the case, but who feel guilty about taking their paid time off. Like that's part of your overall compensation package at a company. You should use it. It's like if you didn't collect your salary, right? You don't use your PTO. Taking care of your body and mind on your own terms, again, not enforced on you, but figuring out what are the ways that I can engage in wellness for my mental and physical health. And then flow is ideal. Flow is a concept developed by Csikszentmihalyi High, not a name you have to know, and certainly not a name you have to know how to spell. But he was an existential psychologist who talked about when people are very into something they're working on, they can get into a state where like they're just enjoying the moment, they kind of filter everything else out. Time passes without them realizing it. So that's an ideal. Not everyone can get that at their workplace. Alrighty, so we'll wrap up this lecture and then we have a couple activities that we will do on Friday related to this. Everybody have a good day. If people have not turned in their exam, you need to do so basically now, or you get a 0.